Hey folks, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today I want to talk about game design documents. There was someone in the comments, I believe they were a student, who've made a few games, but they were very interested in how game design documents are used or approached. So I figured the best way to talk about this was to give a couple of examples of how I've seen them used in the industry, in my history, and talk about their value, how they were done, what information they contained. The first one that I want to start with is like the idea of this Bible game design document. Think of this like the player's manual from Dungeons and Dragons. The idea is that it contains every character in the game, every system in the game, every item in the game, every mission in the game, if you were making, say, a single player game, and it is a reference point for everyone forever, and it's continually updated. This is a waste of time. These big game design documents, the only time I've ever really had one was on Freedom Force. It's the very first game that I worked on. And realistically, the only reason we had this is because we didn't have an engine to start building in. We were waiting for the engine programmer to make the engine. I mean, this was a time when we didn't have Unity or Unreal or common off-the-shelf options that we could purchase, and we had to build something. So in order to not waste our time entirely, we did spend a lot of time cataloging and developing out and listing out everything in the game, as well as systems and all that kind of jazz. The reason why this is a big waste of time is it just becomes really unwieldy. Most games beyond a certain size, unless you're making something like Wordle, most games beyond a certain size become so large and so unwieldy that having one document which maintains and is continually updated by someone, the game quickly becomes the reference point. And this is the overarching point that I want to make, but I'll get to that later. So, I wouldn't worry too much about having like a big Bible game design document that you update all the time. Something that I do think is valuable is having kind of like a vision document. Now, this shouldn't be too long. Think of it as maybe a couple of pages long at most. But what it should do is it should probably contain some pillars, something that you can align a team or other people around that describe at a very high level what the outcome is going to be, like what the gameplay is going to be like. It might contain certain very specific key characters that are going to be in the game. Say, for example, the core protagonist and the antagonist, or if your game has classes, very brief, like it's a barbarian, they play like this, their main abilities are this, very high level. It could contain things like we're going to have a single player campaign, it's going to have this many hours of play or this many levels of play. It's going to take you through mountainous terrain and snow terrain, or that kind of thing. The goal of this document is that if people join the team or if people have questions about it, it's something that is very easily referenced that you can give someone, and very quickly they can read through it and they can get on the same page for it as everyone else who's working on the project, with regards to, hey, this is the game that we're building. This is the game that we're working on. After that initial phase of introduction to the game project or the game team, it's pretty unlikely that that person will ever go back and reference that document again. And that's okay. It's just meant to be a starting point. Because it's short and concise, it's probably fairly easy to keep that document up to date as well. If there are major changes, like say at one point the document mentions we're going to have multiplayer, and then you have to cut multiplayer, then that's easy to update. So that's kind of like a vision document, short, sharp, very high level. The goal is just to get people aligned around what the vision of the game is. Then there's what I kind of refer to as concept documents. Along the way, when you're making a game, you're going to come across a moment when you need to start working on a new feature. Let's say, for example, you want to build a skill tree and you want to add a skill tree to the game. I think it actually is kind of healthy to sit down and spend some time writing out what is the purpose, what is the functionality, how is the skill tree going to work, how will players access the skill tree, is it a button, do they press S, is it mapped to a controller button, what does it look like, what's its layout, how many nodes are on there, what sort of things do you do, does it affect the like one character, or is it broad, is it across multiple characters? The the value of doing this is it forces you to think through it a little bit before you start implementing something. Now, don't get me wrong, don't spend too much time writing this out. A few days at most writing this out. The other benefit to this document is it is also a way of sharing the idea with other people and soliciting feedback. It's an early opportunity to be able to say, hey, team, hey, other designers, hey, engineers or artists, here is my pitch for what I think the skill tree should accomplish. And then that lets them ask questions about it, which can help you shore up your own ideas and perspectives on it. And then also refine the idea. Like, it's probably inevitable that someone's going to make a suggestion that improves it, or ask a question that you hadn't thought about that you might then need to go back and rethink about and readdress, or maybe you change the design a little bit. Again, don't spend too much time on this, and think about this as a piece of concept art before a piece of concept art that is given to a 3D modeler before they go ahead and start actually modeling. There's going to be a lot more depth to it that's figured out once it's started to be implemented. I would actually suggest doing the concept document for most of the major features in your game. Say if you're making an RTS game and you're building a level, well, that's probably worth doing a concept doc that describes how many units does the player have at the beginning, what does the level look like, what is the purpose of the level, where does it fit in the entire narrative of the story campaign, what goals or objectives are the players going to have while they're playing out the mission, what are the win and lose conditions, that sort of thing. Again, it's about aligning your own mind around what it is you're going to build before you just start building things. The next document is what I would call more like a spec doc. The purpose of this and the audience for this document is probably going to be some sort of engineer. This is for the scenario where you are probably on a bigger team. You're working with a few other designers and then a few other engineers. And there's an amount of programming that needs to happen for a feature in order to make it fully fleshed out, that the engineer will need to understand what they need to do in order to build it for you. Again, this is probably on larger teams. We would have done this quite often on, say, World of Warcraft. I remember doing this for some of the functionality for Warfronts. For example, we wanted the ability to spawn in buildings that then consumed that pathfinding. We didn't have that technology. Like, it would update the pathfinding for all the units in the game when the new footprint for the building existed versus when it didn't before. So there was a document that I wrote that was quite technical, I guess, that listed out all the different functionalities that we were going to need from the tool itself, because what the engineers were building was not just the ability for the building to spawn in and out. It was also, they were constructing a tool that we would then use in order to set up the buildings. So there had to be a lot more forethought there in order to ensure that the engineer ended up with or provided the solution that we thought we were going to need in order to create the ability for these buildings to pop in and out of Warfronts and upgrade in Warfronts. That, it's got a very specific audience. The engineer is going to have very unique questions that a designer might not. So it is different from a concept document. Now, they may evolve from one to the other. A concept doc might spawn the spec doc, and they will probably be related to one another. In fact, the engineer would probably find it valuable to have visibility into the concept doc so they can get the broader picture of what it is you're trying to accomplish. But by having that spec doc, it becomes a much more, these are the variables that I'm going to need to tune. This is the functionality. These are the edge cases. It might even include some test case scenarios, like place the building when there's units on top of it and make sure those units spawn to a nearby location, something along those kind of lines. Again, that's really only valuable if you have a larger team where you have engineers working quite separately from designers. If you're on an indie game and you're the person who's doing the design and the engineering, it might be worth doing that spec doc for a more complicated thing. It kind of depends on how far along you are with your technical competency and how experienced you are. Also, how complicated the feature is. If it is a relatively straightforward feature, which you've built out a few times before, you probably don't need to write that spec doc. But if it is something a lot more complicated, like you've never done pathfinding before and you want to implement pathfinding for some new units in your game, well, then I'd probably recommend sitting down and writing out a spec doc just to give yourself the opportunity to think through it a bit more. Then there are narrative or script documentation for Dawn of War, the Imperial Guard, Winter Assault, Dawn of War Winter Assault, the Imperial Guard one. It's funny, I always think about it as the Imperial Guard, not Winter Assault, because Imperial Guard was the whole big point of it. But for that, we had an external writer. I'm not a good author or writer by default, so we used an external one, Lucian. And so we had a script. We did have a fairly detailed script because that was a consulting work, and he would send me updates to the script on a regular basis, and then we would leverage that script and integrate that script into the into the missions themselves. We started by having mission docs, kind of like those concept docs, that we had the script integrated into so that we knew, okay, this is when these lines are going to be said, this is when these lines are going to be said. But in general, eventually the mission just became the document. That narrative script is actually very important as well, because that also then can turn into something that is leveraged for recording. If you are doing any kind of voice acting recording, then the voice actor needs the script so that they can read the lines. There are many tools out there nowadays which will automatically generate those lines for you from your code. We built one for Freedom Force way back when, but it spat out like, this is the line, this is the character, this is context. And then the script could also be used for localized text. But again, and this is kind of the big thing with all of these documents. Something I like to say is you ship a game, you don't ship the documentation. So keep that in mind when it comes to having to maintain it or update it or keep it relevant. At a certain point in time, the game becomes the documentation. I know that there are a lot of product people out there or QA people who really want this continually up-to-date piece of written documentation that reflects whatever is happening in the code. I think that makes a lot of sense in traditional technology or maybe medicine tech or something. For games, I honestly just think it's a bit of a waste of the designer's time. If the designer is having to update say an ability like Fireball, like change how much damage it does in the game, and then once they have it working there, they then have to go back to another document and update that document, it's just a waste of time. A better approach there would be to empower the QA people who are looking for that answer just to have access to the data so they can look at the raw data and understand, hey, yeah, Fireball does 90 damage on impact and then 10 damage on tick for X number of seconds. And then they could just infer from that, and then they're testing if it is accurate or not. So big takeaway for game design documentation. Game design Bibles are a waste of time. Don't worry about them. If you find yourself writing them and spending a lot of time writing them, put it down, pick up Unity, and start teaching yourself how to make something instead. Once you are like, game design documents rarely survive the first line of code. As soon as an engineer starts building something, that game design document's probably out of date because certain decisions get made along the way that are going to make it obsolete. And the ideal is that you, the designer, are very integral to how that engineer is making those decisions so that you become the design document. You are reflecting it. The last thing I'll say is from a tool perspective, first and foremost, the design documents are just tools, but what you use to write them, it varies. It kind of depends on what it is you're looking to communicate. For a spec doc, it's probably going to be something like Google Docs or Word Docs is what I've used in the past. For concept doc, I've actually started using things like Miro. I believe that visual language is really compelling, and being able to integrate a lot of flowcharts or images or anything like that into the document that can help to convey and communicate what it is you're trying to build, that can be more effective than having someone read paragraphs and paragraphs of documentation. For example, if you are looking to replicate the way that the prince moves in the latest Prince of Persia side-scroller game, well, it's probably easier and faster just to have a couple of GIFs of what it is you're trying to accomplish than it is trying to explain a lot of that. And that's where Miro tools on that kind of side of things can come in really valuable. So I hope this was helpful. I hope this is valuable. If you have any follow-up questions, please do ask them in the comments section below. So thanks for taking the time to watch. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.